Hello, I'm here at First Christian Church with two of the absolute best violinists with whom I have ever had the privilege to work, and they are the centerpiece of our wonderful program this week. So we have with us our concertmaster, Jacob Klock, and we have our principal second violinist, Elisa Wicks, but they are far beyond their titles. In Jacob's case, he is one of the most versatile musicians I've ever come across, and a whale of a fiddle player as well. And in Elisa's case, she is so skilled in early repertoire, Baroque, early classical, that she is really our guide whenever we're playing that repertoire. And so we have this wonderful program where we have two different versions of the Four Seasons. We have the first one, which was Vivaldi's, and then we have an Americanized version by Mark O'Connor. And they're very different pieces, but they're a lot of fun. This is going to be one of the funnest concerts you are going to see ever. So I wanted to talk with these two wonderful violinists about what we're doing this week. And let's start with your impressions of playing the entire piece, because I know a lot of times for violinists, they might do one concerto from the Four Seasons, and then they don't get to do anything else for a while. So let's start with you, Elisa. What was it like playing that whole long slog? And there's so much challenge there. There's so many notes. Yeah. What was it like?
Well, it's 12 movements between the four concertos, and so coming up with character and interesting things to do to keep them fresh and to just really infuse every moment of music with lots of interest, was really a delight, but also a challenge. And it's just so many notes, In a typical violin concerto, you'll have 2D sections where the orchestra's playing, and then the soloist plays, and then the soloist sort of gets breaks when the orchestra's playing. But not with Vivaldi. Mm-hmm. You're playing the whole time, from top to bottom. Right. 12 movements, 4 concertos. So for me, one of the biggest challenges was actually just to have the physical strength to be able to play it all, and to be able to have the same energy at the beginning as I did at the end. Mm-hmm. So I had to increase my practice time every week and just keep working all the time.
Excellent. And Jake, the O'Connor is very different. Now you've played both. You've played Four Seasons, and so now you've played this new idea, this new take on Four Seasons.
Right. Tell
me how they're different.
Wow. Well, on a very basic level, the O'Connor Four Seasons, or the American Seasons, is very much just a extended fiddle piece, I think. I think it has much more continuity throughout, whereas the Vivaldi Four Seasons, each movement is its kind of its own little world. But still, there's that progression from spring to winter, and in the case of O'Connor, it's from birth to death, more or less. Mm-hmm. And so there's still, you still go through these seasons of life, or of weather, I suppose. The Vivaldi, I think Elisa's right. There might be more consistent playing all the time. And in the O'Connor, I think the fiddle part, the solo violin / fiddle part, has a little bit more play back and forth with the orchestra.
I can see that. I can totally see that. Yeah. Now, Elisa, with the Vivaldi,
sure.
This is part of the challenge for you, is that he's bringing the character of all these different seasons mm-hmm. into every single movement, and in conjunction with a sonnet. So we have everything from winds to bugs biting and fire among the trees and a barking dog. We have everything, in here that we're trying to describe.
Yeah.
And one of the funnest things was watching you use techniques that we don't normally see on this piece, and it brought out all these unusual colors. Tell us about your process.
So in the Baroque period, music was very experimental. They weren't afraid to use the bow in different ways. They weren't afraid to use the instrument in different ways, to tune it in different ways, all kinds of things. And that feeling has sort of been lost in a sense. And often when we think of Baroque repertoire, we think of it like it's sort of this pretty little box. But it wasn't at all. You know, it was so much about the feelings and the affects and your sensations and intuitions. And so trying to infuse that back into music is what I really love. Like, to me, that's one of the most fun things to do with any repertoire. And I think it was a great juxtaposition between the Vivaldi and the O'Connor, because Vivaldi was so groundbreaking, and he brought in fiddle characteristics, and he brought in, you know, all sorts of play between the words of the sonnets and then the music. And I feel like O'Connor did that too, that, you know, he's playing with how life moves along, he's using different fiddle techniques, different ways to use a violin. And so I think that that's really interesting and makes it fun for the audience, makes it super fun for the performers.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the techniques, the unusual techniques we're going to see you use?
Sure. So I use a technique where you play on top of the bridge, and it makes it kind of scratchy. You'll especially hear that at the beginning of winter. We call it ponticello, if you're interested in the Italian. And I also used where I played out over the fingerboard to get a more sort of fluffy, soft sound. There were trills. I used a few slides, which normally we think, oh no, you would never do that in Baroque music. But they absolutely did. You know, and so I wanted it to sound like birds. Sometimes I was bouncing my bow. At one point we had the violins in the orchestra using the stick of the bow to make little like clicking sounds. Also the violins use pizzicato where they're plucking the strings, and just really exploring the whole range.
Excellent, excellent. So Jake, tell me, where did you get your fiddle skills? Everybody knows you as a very serious classical musician, and
Sure.
yet then we see you unleash on something, you know, bluegrass, and it's incredible. Where did this happen?
Well, I kind of like to think of it as a work in progress. It's another part of my playing that I still feel like I'm developing. My original exposure to it was about 5 or 6 years after I started the violin, so I was maybe 10 or 11 years old. There was a group formed. Basically, the purpose of the group was to train like kids in orchestra how to play old-time fiddle tunes. And so that was my first exposure to it, although it was a little bit limited in scope, I would say. Like, we were reading off of sheet music, and I suppose I still do that. But you know, it was a start into you know, the subtle ways that violin playing and fiddle playing are different. In fiddle playing, there's a fair amount of swinging the notes, whereas in classical music we don't do that so much. And then I kind of abandoned fiddle playing for a while when I was a teenager and on through college. And then it's been 8 or 9 years now, maybe. I began playing with a local guy, songwriter named Joe Johnson, and a lot of what he does, it's not strictly bluegrass. Some of it's country music, kind of in the style of Hank Williams, or some of the outlaw country, Willie Nelson and Townes Van Zandt and artists like that. And then he also does a fair amount of blues. And so there's all these different styles of American music, and I've had lots of practice learning songs by ear and trying to accompany and listen to what he's singing and try to play the right thing at the right time. And so that's all sort of converged in this O'Connor concerto.
Right. So speaking of converging, so much of the piece comes down to the big cadenza in the last movement. You know, the rest of the time, the orchestra's always there, and there's always a conversation going on. Suddenly, near the end of the last movement, very typical near the end of a concerto often, there would be a cadenza.
Right.
And on the recording, it's like a 4 or 5 minute cadenza. He's all over the place, and it's incredible, and it is just like this indelible part of the performance. And then we get the music, and none of it's written out. So tell me about your process with the cadenza. I mean, so much hinges on this one moment. Tell me about your process there.
Well, it's a little funny. When you were the one who had introduced the piece to me, you said, check this out and listen to it. So that was, I don't know, before coronavirus happened. And I said, okay, I listened to it. So, sure, I'll do that piece. And I had forgotten that there was that cadenza. So I got the sheet music and started working, and then I realized, oh, there's 5 minutes of just me playing, and I'm going to have to either figure out exactly what O'Connor does, or I'm going to have to come up with something of my own to play. And ultimately I decided to come up with my own thing, mainly because I was worried about the difficulty in transcribing what Mark O'Connor did, which is a pretty amazing cadenza. And I didn't want to not do that justice, and I thought I could have my own. It would be an interesting opportunity to do my own thing there. So I basically, to use a bad pun, I fiddled around with it, just trying out different licks and trying to incorporate some of the themes, which is sort of appropriate for a cadenza. That's what you're supposed to do, I suppose. And I ended up writing it out mainly so in the recorded environment, I didn't want to get lost in my own thoughts.
Which is really fun. I mean, I've seen you like totally improvise
Right.
a cadenza in front of an audience, and it's really fun. Your mind always wanders to really cool places. But I can see when the mic's running and the camera's running, I can see being a little extra careful. But it was great. I mean, the cadenza, that was like the highlight, because we had all been rehearsing the entire piece so much. We hadn't heard the cadenza. This was the first time, it was in the recording session, we actually got to hear the whole cadenza. And it was just such a great moment because you really did capture so much from the piece. So last question for each of you. Elisa, I have to ask, in the grand scheme of violin concertos, and there are so many that are really standard to the repertoire, where does, at least in terms of difficulty and the real challenge for the performer, because I don't think a lot of people understand just what a challenge this really is from an artistic standpoint, but where does this rank among the violin concerti?
Oh, that's kind of a hard question because there's so many different styles and different genres of concerti. I would say that this is the hardest challenge that I've come up against. Technically, there's plenty to work on, but I really wanted to have a performance that was different from sort of anybody else's. So I listened to a lot of different videos, a lot of different recordings, and I really looked at a lot of different ideas and then tried to come up with my own material. So that often adds challenge of its own when you're trying to come up with unique ideas and do something that has been played for hundreds of years. So it was the biggest challenge I've had. But I have to say that it was a wonderful challenge, and especially the slow movements where I got to put in lots of ornaments and really be free with the way that I like to play and put my own stamp on it was really my favorite part.
Yeah, well, we enjoyed that too.
Yeah.
So, and it was a real teaching moment for you. There were so many times we just had you just turn around, show the orchestra what you're doing, and it helped so much because your expertise is so impressive in this, and a lot of times with Baroque we don't take the chances. So you really taught us to take some chances, and I really appreciate that.
I think it's worth it.
Now, Jake, I have to ask sort of the same question. I mean, the people might hear this, and if they just sit back and they listen, they might think, oh, it's just a nice fiddle piece, not even all that difficult. Whereas we know this was a super hard piece, much like Appalachian Spring, dances, that kind of thing. But Copeland throws in all these crazy multimeters, and there are like these white knuckle moments where it's like so difficult and everybody's got to be super focused. This is like the entire O'Connor. There's almost never a moment where you can sort of relax and just sort of let things happen. But, where does this thing rank among like the major concerti that people would know? I especially that first movement, I was astonished by your technique in the development especially. I mean, this is not an easy thing. You make it sound easy, and of course people think fiddling, oh, well, it can't be that tough. No. Tell us what this was for you.
Right. So Mr. O'Connor gives the soloist quite the series of obstacles in the development, especially of the first movement. First of all, he decides it's necessary to go visit all 12 major keys. Right. So we're going through all the keys, and there's continual mixed meter. So first we're counting in 3, and then we're counting in 2, and then there's a measure of 13 16th notes.
Yep.
And then it gets very, very fast. There's a bunch of like blistering fast notes flying all over the place. And then more key changes. And for me, fortunately, I feel like I came from a background. I played some rock music and stuff in high school, and me and my friends would nerd out to playing in odd time signatures. So it didn't scare me as much as maybe someone else, but it was plenty to study. And where does it rank in the overall scheme of violin concertos? It's tough to say. A lot of them they all have their peculiar challenges and set of difficulties. Completely contrasting the Vivaldi, which is so standard, everybody has played it, and so the challenge there is to offer something new, which I think you totally did.
No, thank you.
The O'Connor is kind of about, the only recording available that I'm aware of is Mark O'Connor's own recording. Mm-hmm. So how do you walk the line between kind of honoring what he wrote as the composer and trying to find maybe something new to bring to the piece? And then, of course, there's the cadenza, which a lot of violin concertos have a cadenza, but not so many of them are in a fiddle style that requires, and it's not just one fiddle style. There was, throughout the piece, kind of a more Appalachian sound. There are Irish jig feeling kind of moments. Mm-hmm. There's just sort of, I don't know what to call it, but sort of slow lament, soulful fiddle playing. There's some blues and even some jazz. There's like, he specifies swung 16th notes. So just trying to be aware of all the styles and not try to keep it exciting and not do the wrong style at the wrong time.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and Mark O'Connor has requested a DVD of our performance of this. So I can't wait. I hope he'll write us. I hope he'll say a little something. It's always a privilege when the composer is still around. And I know that he's going to be just deeply impressed by everything you put into this. So I think we'll wrap up there, but I want to thank everybody at home. Thanks for your continued support of the Chamber Orchestra. You're going to be knocked out by this concert. You're going to be so happy to hear this. It's going to be the high point of your month, I am quite sure. And I want to thank again these two wonderful violinists. You're going to be hearing much more of them in the near future. In fact, when the pandemic hit, we actually had to cancel a concert that included the Brahms Violin Concerto with Jake. So we're going to take that back up for sure. Yeah. We're going to be doing that as soon as we can get everybody back together. But both of these wonderful violinists are so important to everything we do here at the Chamber Orchestra. So we thank them, we thank you, and enjoy the concert.